Hello and welcome to Talking Automotive. Today we've got a different perspective on the industry. We've got the customer's view, and we've got Steve Blunt, who is a EV intender, someone who's looking at buying an EV and has lots of questions for us around what he should be looking for in the EV purchase decision.
Hi, Mark. It's fascinating discussion because being in the industry, we often take some of the things for granted about what we think a customer or what he considers to purchase a vehicle. And it's good to now get into a customer's perspective and understand exactly the type of things he's looking for and what he sees as a challenge. Because sometimes we think, like for instance, range, we think there's absolutely no problem with range, but it's still a big consideration on behalf of the customer. So interesting discussion. So let's jump into it.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services is an independent division of Precar Services, offering specialty fleet fit-outs for commercial applications ranging from simple tray and tow bar fitments to fully bespoke service body and accessory installation. With quality-assured safety, compliance and standardisation of vehicle builds, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies, and original equipment manufacturers. For further information on how Precar Fleet Services can assist in solving your commercial vehicle fit-out needs, please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
If you like what you hear today, please subscribe below and reach out to either John Sinclair or myself, Mark Palavestra, on LinkedIn, or leave a message in the commentary below.
So today we're talking to Steve Blunt. Steve is a potential new car buyer in the market. And part of the challenge today is he's looking to consider whether he should purchase an electric vehicle or not. Before today's episode, here is a quick word from our sponsor.
CarsApp is a digital platform across both web and app clients that helps sellers of motor vehicle assets to reach and transact with a larger audience in the B2B space. CarsApp allows you to seamlessly and efficiently list your wholesale inventory either by DMS integration or manual entry, and then transact either via a tender format or in the marketplace. Why let your wholesale inventory only be made available to a limited number of buyers when you can tap into an engaged buyer marketplace on CarsApp with a national reach of over 800 plus registered users? Increase your audience and improve your returns on your wholesale stock. Connect with CarsApp via LinkedIn or on the web at carsapp.com.au, or reach out directly to Andrew Tyson at andrew.tyson@carsapp.com.au.
So Steve, thanks for joining us today and welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. Great to see you both. Excited to be having this conversation today.
We've always been on the OEM where we're selling the vehicles, but it's good to now have a look from a customer point of view. And what are the things that are you looking at and what are your challenges to buy a vehicle?
Absolutely. And I should declare I don't come from the automotive industry. I'm a guy who's had a career in technology. And so technology interests me, but I've never worked in the motor vehicle industry.
So maybe to start us off, Steve, can you just tell us a little bit about where you're at in terms of thinking about a vehicle? So what are some of the questions you'd like to ask us today?
Sure. So, just by background, married, mid-50s, 3 kids. 3 kids have left home. So we're at that sort of stage of life where, a few things are changing. One of the things is different. We've just recently sold our family home and doing some things there. And one of the things I need to do is start thinking about new cars. So my wife and I both have, we have a petrol car and a diesel car. My diesel car is about 8 years old. Hers is about 5 years old. Been watching with interest the electric vehicle industry grow. We spent, in fact, as a family, 5 years in California between 2005 and 2010 living there. And I was stunned when we arrived that everybody was driving a Prius. When I think about my introduction to electric vehicles, it came from living in California, where that's just blossomed. That's just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And each time I go back, I just see more electric vehicles on the road. So I've been around electric vehicles for 10 years plus. I buy into the idea it's good for the planet for us to move down that path. But here in Australia, the bug hasn't hit me yet. I've still got a lot of questions around the cost of vehicles, the infrastructure that exists, this idea of parking up your car, for half an hour to recharge your vehicle just doesn't sort of fit well with the idea of driving in, filling up your car with fuel and 5 minutes later being done with that task. So there's a whole bunch of things that sort of hold me back from making the investment, but I at some point would like to make that investment. So I'm really fascinated by the conversation with and with your combined experience. I'm sure we can cover a bit of ground today.
It's interesting, Steve, that you've got an 8-year-old car. Is that the one you're going to change first before the 5-year-old car?
Yeah, probably. So that's the SUV type of car that I bought when the kids were towards the end of their schooling years. We needed a big car, 5 of us in the car. It's a 7-seater type thing. So that's probably the one we would change over first. But, we want to ultimately change over both. I tend to keep our cars 5 to 7 years. So that's sort of both. Well, the one is outside of that range, but we're now sort of ready to make that investment.
You're in an SUV. Do you plan to stay in an SUV, or are you looking at a different type of vehicle?
Probably stay in an SUV, a smaller one though. Doesn't need to be a big SUV. It can be a smaller one, but I sort of quite like that higher driving style. We've got a couple of dogs, so that's helpful to have that facility. So one would be an SUV, and one could be, a regular sedan or hatchback or whatever it needs to be.
And as far as your lifestyle, do you travel long distances in your cars? Is that what is? Or are you planning to travel long distances, or is it going to be mainly a metropolitan with maybe a 200 or 300 kilometre drive associated with it every now and then?
So historically, we haven't done a lot of driving. I think because of where we're at our stage of life, we are going to change that. We now have a property down on the peninsula. Now that's only 100 kilometres away, but there's a return trip there. Our daughter is based up in Bendigo now, so she's living up there. So that's a little bit further, and we would like to do some travel. For us, that sort of idea of how could we travel around Australia in an electric vehicle becomes an interesting conversation, and therefore perhaps one of the things that we will do is an electric vehicle on one side, and we'll keep a regular vehicle on the other side. But again, that will sort of come down to my questions and how that infrastructure is in place today. How
important is the environment to you as far as greenhouse gas emissions, and from a rating of 1 to 10, is it a 10? It's the ultimate in decision making process, or is it a sort of blend halfway through?
I'd probably I would say definitely we need to be doing the right thing by the world. This planet only has so much capacity. Do I live on the edge of my sort of green thinking? Probably not. I'd probably say I'm a 7 or an 8. I want to do the right thing, but I want it to work for me as much as for other things. So we're doing a renovation on a house. We'll put solar on that house. Solar on houses is not a new technology, but we will do that. But with a car, I think for me, I still have a lot of questions around that whole infrastructure side of things and the cost. So cost, as an example, I don't know whether I am green enough to say I would pay a premium for an electric car over a petrol car. Yet, I am certainly very conscious of doing the right thing by the planet, as I think, as I hope everybody is. Now, I recognise at that sort of top end, there are people who want to go quickly, and others who, don't want to go as quickly. I'd probably sit, somewhere at a 7 in terms of my commitment to it.
And another question around your purchase decision.
Yeah.
How do you, I'm keen to get an idea of what you value from a cost perspective. Is it the purchase price, or do you look at the whole of life cost Would that be the sort of thing you'd be happy for an upfront, heavier investment, but a better return over a longer period of time? Or how would you gauge what a value proposition would be from a purchasing perspective?
For me, the price obviously is important. I tend not to think about the cost of running a vehicle. I'm not that engaged in that sort of thinking. I buy a car, I run it, I buy a new car. So for me, I'm not, I don't look at the entire life cycle, if you like. The initial cost of a car is important to me, mainly from a sort of a value point of view. I mean, cars have become very expensive in Australia, and it grieves me how expensive all cars have become in Australia, particularly when you compare it to the US, where you can buy the same car for half the price almost. That upfront cost is important, but beyond that, I tend not to think about the running costs, because it's sort of, sometimes when you do think about it, for me, it sort of frightens me about how much money we pour into vehicles.
No, I think, Steve, EV is undeniably the future. All admit that. And I think you're seeing countries like Norway already starting to say that by 2030, 2035, they're going to ban the internal combustion engine. I think we've been a little bit slower in Australia because there hasn't been the government support, as you've seen in Europe. So I think there's going to be some changes. But I think it just takes one sort of big event that's going to switch it. And then I think we'll turn quite quickly. It'll be quite surprising how quickly we can turn. So to me, that's going to be quite interesting to see what that could be, whether it's government intervention or something else that might happen. In Australia here, we've already seen the floods, we're seeing the climate change in terms of the fires. So we're seeing a lot of things happening there. So it'll be interesting to see what really switches people to then say, well, they have to do some sort of event change. But I think also, on the other hand, electric vehicles solve a solution for small cars and passenger cars, but we still have a challenge around the big diesel engines for like marine, rail, standby generators, and all those sectors of the market, which play a pretty big part in creating emissions in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you a few questions then. So let's start with the cost. My perception, really, that would be from online advertising, because I haven't gone to any, car dealerships yet or car organizations to start researching cars. But my perception is an electric vehicle is quite expensive by comparison to today's cars. Is that a true statement, or have I got that wrong?
No, I think you're 100% right there. So I think an electric car, if you take a small electric car, you're probably looking at around 22,000 to 24,000 for an internal combustion engine. But that same electric vehicle maybe be around 50,000. Now, on average, over 3 years of running the vehicle, you will save probably around $16,000 in terms of saving on fuel costs such as diesel or petrol, and then the servicing costs, because you don't need to service electric vehicles much as it. So if you add that 16,000 to the 22 or 24,000, you get to around 38, 40,000. So there's still around a $10,000 difference. But that's all averages. So if you travel a lot less, your saving will be less. And if you travel a lot more, your saving will be more. So, and that's where it comes in, if you don't have government intervention to narrow that $10,000 gap. The chasm is too big for people to jump. They just can't afford to spend that extra amount of money. And also up front, and they benefit only down the road through the ownership of the vehicle. Government are able to bring in incentives or tax incentives or apply certain taxes in that, or free charging, or you get travel certain routes free, or you can go on ferries for free, those type of things, which I've done in Norway. That makes it a lot cheaper. And then as it gets closer to being the same price as an internal combustion engine, then you'll probably see a big jump.
So Mark, does that really go to your point that we need to think about the total cost of the car rather than just the upfront fee? Because then you can start to do some comparisons of what the real cost is.
That's the big difference with EV. Is a total different. It's actually a different mindset. When you purely look at purchase price right now, definitely, as per what John's saying, the purchase price is significantly higher than, say, an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engines have become very efficient from a production perspective, from a consumption perspective, and a reliability perspective. Whereas EVs, it's a new technology. It's still, it's all about the battery. The battery is the expensive part. Electric motors have been around for a very long time, and there's obviously improvements that have been done along the way with the actual electric motors, and the drivetrains are very robust. And the drivability is very different to a internal combustion engine, because your torque curve is immediate. You've got maximum torque right from the word go, whereas with a internal combustion engine, you've got to build up to the torque curve, and the power curve is different to the torque curve. So depending on what you use it for, diesels are great with lots of torque down low. EVs will have even more torque down low, which there's a lot of misconceptions that an EV can't tow. Well, in fact, it's the opposite. They can tow very well. The challenges are around the things that John was talking about. So you're paying up a lot of upfront cost to purchase the technology, but running it and charging it, and especially if you're putting solar on your roof, it's actually cost neutral. There is zero cost. You're actually filling up your vehicle with free energy that you're getting from the sun. So that's very cost effective. And this is where it comes into what are the motivators? Because right now, there aren't the government incentives to bring that initial purchase price down to a range that the savings on fuel will make it economically viable. And this is the other bit that we now look at, and we've had a conversation with some car subscription organisations. Subscriptions are a way to get around this big purchase cost. So if you just want to have a car for so much per week or so much per month, the subscription model makes a lot of sense. And you can get into an EV without having to pay that $50,000, $60,000 premium for a small car that John's talking about. So you're looking at, well, what does that car cost me per month? And does that fit with my budget? So you will be paying for some of the depreciation. And the biggest cost in owning any car is actually the depreciation cost. That's the number one. The mileage that John talks, or the kilometres that John talks of, the downside with EVs currently is that you're going to be recharging a lot to do those high Ks. So the range has been a problem in the early days of EV, but now that's well and truly getting within a very palatable number. Like 300-400 kilometres is actually quite mainstream now, whereas previously it was around about 100 to 150 Ks. Your trip down to the peninsula, well and truly covered there and back, and probably can do 2 trips there before you need to recharge. But when you drive down the peninsula, you park it up and you plug in like you do with your iPhone or your Android. You plug it in, you just charge it up, and it becomes second nature. That you just pull into where your driveway is, plug in. Now, a lot of people talk about, well, but I live in an apartment, I have on-street parking. Well, they've actually had on-street parking in Europe for quite a long time. In fact, not many people have garages. If you look at the EV take-up in, say, France. And the Europeans have been very good in adopting with power poles, very small little like parking meters with cables, and just plug your cars in and away you go. So that can be overcome with investment. And that's the next thing that has to happen, is further infrastructure investment to give you peace of mind to be able to charge up with these new technologies of fast chargers. The other thing, and we talk about the jumping the chasm, the early innovators and early adopters were quite happy to accept the slower charge rates by virtue of having an EV, because it looks different. The early EVs actually looked very different to the mainstream cars, so they stood out, and that's what the early innovators and adopters wanted. Same as the Priuses looked different to other cars, because you want to make a statement that I'm actually doing something different. But what you're seeing now is more of the EVs coming on board look very similar to the mainstream vehicles. In fact, you mentioned the hybrids. So the best-selling cars in the electric space are actually petrol electric hybrids, which are the RAV4 has really done exceptionally well, because it looks like a normal RAV. And it's not that much more expensive than a straight-out internal combustion version. So there isn't that excessive premium. There is a slight premium, but it's a premium that narrows that chasm versus what the previous hybrids were. When we look at pure EVs, there's still a significant gap. And in Europe, the governments of the various countries there have actually provided support and incentives to bring that gap down so that the subscription models work or the leasing arrangements work where you enter into a lease on the vehicle, or even lease the battery separate to the vehicle.
Wow.
Because the battery was always the most expensive part. Now, battery technology is getting better and better as each year passes. So, they're getting cheaper to make, and a lot of that's been driven out of China because they're getting better and better at producing batteries for vehicles, and they've invested heavily in EV technology. So that's coming down. The price of it's coming down. It's still a gap, but it's getting cheaper and the range is getting better. So it comes down to how do you finance it? The vehicles will go for very long periods of time because there's less moving parts and there's actually less servicing that needs to be done. So the average service on a diesel vehicle, once you get over the 60,000 Ks, is you're looking between $400 and $800 for a mainstream vehicle. If you're looking for a premium car, it's a lot more than that. So with EVs, you won't have any of that. You'll have very basic servicing for EVs. So the longer you keep them, the costs will actually be less. So, and that's why probably the financing model or the subscription model makes it more palatable to take on an EV.
So as someone whose career has been in technology, I'm very comfortable with the subscription model. Nowadays, a lot of technology is through a subscription model. And as you say, that gets away from that huge upfront cost and just moves to more of a monthly or quarterly fee, weekly fee. I got lots of questions out of what you've both said. Just on the Crossing the Chasm, I'm reminded of the Crossing the Chasm book by Jeffrey Moore. So when I was in California, I got to work with a guy called Jeffrey Moore who wrote a series of books, but one of them was called Crossing the Chasm. And the chasm is the gap between early adopters of a piece of new technology all the way through to what he would call mainstream markets. I've been an early market adopter of certain technologies. So I stood in line for the very first iPad in Palo Alto in about 2007 it was, with Steve Jobs out the front of the Palo Alto Apple store. And I was there with about 5,000 other people queuing for the very first iPad. So I've been an early adopter on that type of technology. On this one, I'm not an early adopter. I think I'm in that mainstream marketplace, and I would say I'm in the early majority. But that's, I think it's very relevant. Jeffrey's book from probably about 2000 and, I don't know when he wrote it, 2006 or so, is very true in this particular case. In terms of some of the comments that you both made, so let's start with the distances of vehicles. I have in my head, again, this is based on not a lot of research, that a vehicle could do 300 or 400 kilometers now. Is that a fair statement, or are we seeing that grow continually? What's sort of the distance on a single charge for a vehicle?
Steve, on average now, you're seeing vehicles they can do 400 kilometers. But it depends. There's a whole lot of factors that it depends on. It depends on how many passengers you have. If you're taking your son to footy and he's 6'4" and weighing 120 kgs and he's got his two mates who are the same size, that will impact your distance. If it's very hot or very cold, if you got the heater on or you got the air conditioning on, if you're driving up and down hills, those are all impacted. So if you add all those factors in, it could drop back to, say, 300 kilometers. If you're driving along a flat surface, there's no headwind, nothing's happening, you should be able to get to around the 400 kilometer mark.
And the other consideration that you get with the technology with an EV is when you're going downhill, the vehicle regenerates. So the electric motors actually pump energy back into the battery. So braking as well, it's regenerative braking, so that will put energy back into the battery. So slowing down charges it up, accelerating drains it. So there's this constant ebb and flow of energy between the electric motor and the battery to either extend the range or reduce it, depending with the variables that John mentioned. Another thing, though, that is a bonus with EVs, and John rightly points out that heating and cooling impacts the vehicle and the battery. But the beauty of EVs is that when they're plugged in and charging, you can actually set your temperature to what you want the car to be. So when you jump in the car and unplug it, that vehicle will be set to the temperature that you need. So you don't need to use, it's not jumping on a hot day into a car and you need to fire up the air conditioner to bring the temperature down. It draws a lot of energy out of the engine to do so. With an EV, the air conditioner's conditioning that vehicle whilst it's on charge to mains power. So you've set it up so that it's not hot to start with, or it's not cold to start with. It's only if you're in an environment where it needs to maintain that at a high level is where it will drain that energy.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about the charging element. So firstly, just simplistically, is all I need a 240 volt socket, or does the car plug into something that goes into the electricity? So what's the system that you would have in your apartment or your house? Let's imagine we're renovating this house. What am I going to build into my house? Do I need 3-phase electricity? What is it that the car connects to?
Yeah, so Steve, you need to connect it. You can connect it to just a normal plug point, but your charging rate will be very slow. So it'll take you a lot longer. And it's also not good for the battery. So under emergency situations, so if you went down to your cottage and it was low on charge and you needed to charge it to get back to Melbourne, you could do that. But you need to actually put a proper socket in and have the proper cable between the vehicle and that socket to charge in the quickest way possible.
So therefore, I've got to have a special socket, a special electricity supply to the car. That's what we're saying. You can't just plug it into a straight 240 volt socket.
Well, you can plug into the 240, but it might take you 8 or 10 hours to charge. Whereas if you have the proper connection, it might take you an hour to charge.
So that's something for us to consider actually in our renovations. Because here's my dilemma. So we, as I said earlier, sold our family home. We've moved into an apartment closer to the city. We've got this place down on the peninsula, and we're now going to go between the two. That's sort of how life will be for us. Here in the apartment, because it's an older apartment building, I can't see us having access to a charging station in the basement of the building, not that I'm aware of. So therefore, I think my better charging option would be at the house down on the peninsula. Now, I recognise then there's this whole infrastructure where you can go and plug in. I don't think we're yet market in the street, are we? We don't have, you can't plug into lampposts and parking meter type things here in Australia.
There are some community charge points. A lot of local councils have them near their council facilities. And there are some other organisations that do have charge points in their car parks, in underground car parking, and some shopping centres are already setting them up as well. So it is starting to roll out, but not to the level that we see in Europe, where there are a multitude of power points in the streets with cables already attached to plug into vehicles. But they are starting to roll out.
So let's just talk about that. So here's what I have in my head. That now we're going to think about putting one into the peninsula house and then just working around that for now until either we change our city apartment or, something happens and we have a charging station within the basement. This idea of I would go to a charging station and sit there for a period of time, half an hour, to recharge my car, I think is another, certainly inhibitor for me. I just can't get my head around the current model. And I know this is all a big change management exercise for all of us. I can't get my head around this idea of I would drive to a charging station and sit there for half an hour, whatever the number is, I don't know what it is, whilst I recharge my car. I can see it when I'm at home. I charge my car, and hopefully the number of times I would have to go to a charge station outside of that would be low. But is that the case? You have to sort of sit there for half an hour. I don't know what the numbers are because I can't get my head around it.
Steve, hopefully in the short term, it'll be more difficult, especially if you can't get charging out in the street next to your apartment. But in the long term, I think most of your charging will be done at home, or when you go to the shopping centre to purchase groceries, or you could possibly charge there. So I think the availability of charging will happen, and it'll be only in emergency situations where you actually have to go and sit somewhere and wait half an hour while you do a charge. The challenge is going to be if you travel long distance, if you travel from Melbourne to Sydney, and you need to stop somewhere and charge on the way to Sydney, you might have to do 2 stops or 3 stops.
And each stop then, and that really goes to my point. So let's go to that one, which is, I choose to drive to Sydney, for example. I'm going to have to stop at least once, maybe twice. how long do I have to stop for the current charging technology?
It's about an hour in terms to charge it to full capacity. But that's improving all the time. And I think you're going to get improvement going forward. So each year, the batteries are getting better, the charge is lasting longer, you're getting bigger distance. So I think we'll see improvements in that, but it is a problem. I think short term, you're going to have to really, if that's a problem for you, something you won't be able to do.
Well, at the moment, we don't do a lot of that. As I say, we limit ourselves probably to 250 kilometers. As life changes, maybe that will change as well. But as you say, along the way, the distance you can travel on an electric vehicle will go up. The speed at which you recharge an electric vehicle will improve, and hopefully we'll have more charging stations in different locations. So you don't have to go to a shopping centre. You can just put it into a parking bay along the street somewhere and charge it up and go for a coffee.
The key very much is having a place to charge whilst you're sleeping.
That's right.
And that's interesting. You raise a very good point. If you don't have it in your apartment building, that's a potential barrier for you and your lifestyle. Because otherwise you've got to go down the change management path of, well, I know I'm going to have to drive to this particular shopping centre to do my shopping and park in their designated charging bays because that's where I can charge up. But if I'm low on energy, I really have to make it a direct beeline for there. I can't deviate anywhere other than going there.
Absolutely. Are we seeing companies, employers, put charge stations into their car parks? I remember, when we lived in California, by the time I left, there would have been I worked for an organization. There were about 30 different buildings on this huge campus. Every building had a charge station, and some of the bigger buildings had dozens of charge stations. This is, probably 2009, 2010. Are we seeing that happening in Australia now? So are employers helping their employees with that?
With the big, as far as the office tower and shopping centres, absolutely. So that is always a major consideration for new building construction, is to have that facility, making sure they've got enough capacity in their electrical systems to have those charge points in the basement. From a government perspective, absolutely. So if you look at the public service, they've extensively rolled out charge points. Still, there's more to go, but they do have charge points in all of their major facilities where they have back-to-base people operating vehicles.
Just on government, so I have read around different countries making various commitments. I saw the UK made some commitment recently. Where are we up to, and why do you think we haven't sort of made a commitment to go down the path of other nations?
That's a very good question. I suppose it comes down to cost. It's and the politics of the day. And so we've had ebbs and flows where we've had various governments in that have really pushed the agenda, and others that have parked it. We've had an emission trading scheme, and then we've parked that as well. So it's just definitely something from a government perspective and their view on how much support and what that support would look like.
So let's talk about batteries. I do sort of wonder about this as we move to more people driving electric vehicles and batteries being the primary source of how that vehicle moves. What's going to happen to those batteries? And are we just creating a different challenge for the future, which is hundreds of thousands or millions of batteries that the world has got to deal with because we're shifting cars, and how green is that? So talk to me about battery technology in the context of how green is it, because that sort of goes into my thinking about, well, just how green are electric vehicles for the planet?
Well, I think you're starting to see there's companies now, or some of the automotive companies that have started to set up what they call like 360-degree factories. So from the initial design of the vehicle, they're trying to design it that it can be 100% recycled at the end of life. And they're starting to now take in vehicles that once they reach a certain age, you can return your vehicle there, get a reasonable return for that vehicle, and they'll then recycle it and turn it into components for new vehicles. So that's starting to happen. I think there's still some way to go with EV, and there's not that much transparency on it. And I think that's probably something as consumers we probably need to call out, some sort of visibility on what is a solution for those batteries at end of life. And secondly, what is a solution if the vehicle ends up in a vehicle accident? Because there's a good chance the vehicle will be written off quite quickly if the battery is damaged, the vehicle, because of the battery makes such a big part of the cost of the vehicle. And what happens to those batteries? The other big challenge we have is, and I think we need to start also getting visibility on what metals and components go into the building of the battery, because there's quite a bit of rare earth metals going into those batteries, and now you're starting to see companies mining seabeds and that to get those metals. So it's fine saying, okay, well, I'm driving an EV because it's green, it doesn't do any emissions. But if they're destroying the seabed to get the minerals to produce the batteries, the other big part is, can those batteries be repaired or recycled, or where can they be used elsewhere, maybe as home storage or for solar panels and that. So I think that's going to take a lot of effort. But I think if we don't have any transparency, there's a lot of these new EV companies in and just doing it, and no one's asking that question. I think that's the same type of thing. We need to be getting that sort of transparency with EV batteries.
Well, I'm reminded, John, having been in tech all my life, this was a conversation that the tech industry had to have around printed circuit boards. We were out printing a lot of circuit boards in the early days of computers, and we were just throwing them onto a scrap heap. And so I guess it's probably in that same category that we have to work out, what do we do with this technology that. And how long does a battery last, just out of interest? I mean, are we changing batteries every year, or is there a particular lifespan to them? If I was to buy a car today, how long would I expect my battery to last?
Well, initially they weren't sure. They thought batteries would last between 6 and 8 years, but they're now finding the batteries are lasting far longer than they expected. So I think they're lasting, up to 10, 12 years and that. But I think we're only starting to get those stats now. And I think it depends on where the vehicle's running, how it's running, how often it's being charged. So I think there's a lot of factors going into it. I think my understanding is there's a good market to go into home storage, because you don't need to charge it as fast and you don't draw the power off as fast as in a car. So there is a good opportunity with that. At the moment, the number of batteries coming back is relatively small. But if every vehicle becomes an EV vehicle, you're going to get millions of batteries coming back each year. And there's only so many houses where they could be utilized, or factories or whatever. And then I don't know what will happen after that. And I don't think we have that as clear as we should have. Maybe there is. Maybe that's a discussion for another podcast, is to find someone in that area who we can speak to about that.
It's interesting, John, and Steve, you actually, when you started the discussion today, you're putting solar panels on your place.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges with that is that when you're not using it, that energy is going back into the grid, and you're not actually benefiting from it when you need it at night. So there is significant demand for home batteries. The more we go down this path of solar and being self-sufficient from a sun perspective with our energy, it's storing it on your property. And this is where having enough battery capacity is where there's going to be future demand. And there's a lot of hype around Tesla as a car company, but it's interesting, Tesla's play is more around the technology than the automobiles. Yeah. Yeah. So it's about the cars, the batteries, then the actual, this is an automobile and we're going to sell this much and make X amount out of the cars. Because the organisation has not been profitable in its early iteration, yet its share price is many times that of Toyota, which is the most successful car company out there. Yeah. And the other irony is Toyota aren't investing heavily in EV. They've got a hybrid and also they've got a hydrogen fuel cell play. Yeah. So they've done very well out of the hybrid side of things, because all those concerns that you raise, range anxiety, charging and disruptions to your lifestyle, don't happen with a hybrid. They're slightly different, but you get the EV experience of acceleration, but you have that peace of mind that you've got fuel and you can go anywhere and you don't have the inconvenience of plugging in. Jumping the chasm into a full-blown EV introduces all these other challenges that you have to look at from how did you solve them in your specific instance. Now, the batteries will be good news for you with your solar panels. And you'll need a bank of them to to store that energy that those solar panels are going to collect for you. So, but you wouldn't do that straight away. So you'll need, there's benefits then. You can charge your car up for free basically, which is going to be fantastic. But it's the other bits around, well, hang on, I've got these annoying inconveniences that have to fit in with your life. But if you're looking at it from a green perspective, there will be an aftermarket for those batteries, absolutely. There's one thing that the auto industry and the entrepreneurs in the aftermarket specifically, whether it be recycling copper out of electrical wires or out of copper out of radiators in the old days and the other bits and pieces, the recycling and the pursuit of the metals will ensure that there's enough demand that those batteries won't end up in landfill en masse.
Do you think our circumstances in Australia do create a different challenge for electric vehicle rollout and adoption? Do you think our sort of size, the way we live our lives is different to, say, Europe?
Definitely from a perception perspective, because in Europe, the Europeans wouldn't consider doing a super long trip from, say, Melbourne to Sydney. But the irony is I just did a trip from halfway between Melbourne and Albury, and no one was on the road. I've been doing that drive for over 30 years, and early days were lots of cars, but with cheaper flights, we don't actually do. The perception is here in Australia, we do 1,000-kilometre drives every second day. The reality is we don't. And the majority of trips that we undertake are less than 50 Ks, and then we'll park up somewhere and then do another 50 Ks coming the other way. So even your trip to Bendigo and back, you could do that well and truly with an EV without a problem. So the psychology that we want to because we can, it's a bit like we buy these massive SUVs to go off-road, because one day we'd dream of doing it, but the reality is we never do. We never do, but we can. And that's the thing. We want to know because I'm ready. Correct. Whereas in Europe, the whole idea is, well, I just zip around. I leave my car out on the street, or I'll do a small trip from here to there. I'm not going to drive from France to Turkey, whereas driving from Sydney to Perth is the equivalent. So you just don't do that. In fact, we don't do that here either. Some people do, and they'll have diesel vehicles, and that's great. But for the majority of us, because we are concentrated in a very small tract along the eastern seaboard primarily, some in little pockets over in the west and the south. But really, the journeys that we do are more than adequately covered with even the current range of EVs, and future iterations will be even better again. The secret will be how we manage our time with that car and how we charge it.
And do you see hybrids and other fuel types? You mentioned hydrogen. Do you see there is sort of a stepping stone, rather than people going, I take my petrol car, now I go to an electric vehicle? Do you see there is some sort of stepping stone for people like me?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And a question I forgot to ask you is, have you driven an EV?
I have. Because whenever I go to California, and I've driven hybrids as well. So when I go to visit friends in California, I don't know what it is now, but it seems, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, almost every car is an EV. A lot of Teslas, those types of those types of cars. They're quick. A friend of mine let me borrow his Tesla last time I was there. They're quick off the mark for sure. It's a different experience, but yeah, I have driven them.
And that's the other challenge that we have in this country. If you're jumping from the innovators and early adopters to the early majority, a significant number of the early majority have not experienced an EV. So there's a job for the industry to do to just get people in, the buyers out of that category, to actually experience the vehicle, to get the confidence in it. because that's the other scary thing is that you're talking about a $50,000 to $160,000 car. You're not sure about the technology. I haven't driven it, so therefore I'm not emotionally connected with it. So how do you get that emotional attachment? Because all the rational thinking is saying, don't do it. For all the reasons that you've mentioned, Steve, around this is going to disrupt my life. Why would I want to do this? So the compelling answer to the question of why has to be therein. It's so good to drive. It is so quiet. It is so smooth. It has amazing technology in it. And it's environmentally friendly and it's cost effective in the long run.
Right. So who are the market leaders? Obviously, we hear a lot about Tesla. Who are the? I mean, I don't particularly personally like their designs. You know, as you said, they've tried to be a little extreme with their designs. They don't really do it for me. So, who are the leaders in this space for EVs?
Well, Tesla are in from the high-end perspective, but Tesla don't report their sales. So, for example, in this country, you'd be looking at around that 3,000 units a year would be the sort of volumes that they're selling, but that can't be confirmed because they don't report their numbers. So it would be in that sort of vicinity.
Yeah.
So the main player is actually Toyota with their hybrids. So if you look at the hybrid, the stepping stone still is hybrid to full EV to EV, but hybrid doesn't draw energy out of the grid. So that's where it's not really doesn't fall in the same category as an electric car per se, but it has that electric drivetrain. Yeah. So if you look at the Europeans, the Renault-Nissan alliance are significantly big players and have invested heavily in EVs for a long period of time. And you're seeing the other premiums now are all jumping on board with a significant array of premium SUVs because it goes back to the chasm that you want to jump. If you look at how do you eat an elephant is a small piece at a time. So if you start nibbling the EV elephant from the premium end, early innovators and early adopters, it's the next closest thing to a premium buyer is the one that's going to think, well, I'm going to be spending my $120,000 on a vehicle. I may as well spend $140,000 and get this EV because the brand that I'm going for is European. They're phasing out their ICE vehicles, so I will get one of their EVs because they've got the range improved even further and the technology is becoming more and more robust. Right. So that's the next wave. What Renault and Nissan have done, and along also with Mitsubishi, they're all part of the alliance, is that their EVs are at the mainstream end. So, and that's where they've have achieved a lot of mass in Europe with vehicles like the Zoe, Fluence in the early days, but the Zoe, which is a small little hatch. Mm-hmm. Now, they're great for run-around cars here, but what we see with the Australian psychology is we're very much American in what we buy. Our passenger car range is getting smaller and smaller. We're buying less of them, and more and more are being phased out. It's all about SUVs and crossovers. So it's really that offering in that SUV and crossover that's going to give you the main volumes. So Europeans are doing it with their crossovers from an EV side of things. The key will be what China can bring in here. The Koreans have got some great stuff as well. And Korean product is exceptionally robust, and they've been doing very well from a technology perspective for quite a long period of time. So Korean EVs will be good. We don't do much from the US. Tesla's the only ones that really play here. Most of the American brands, in fact, General Motors are going very much EV, but they're not doing right-hand drive. So we're not going to see any of those here. So and that's a challenge for us. So it's very much European. But then what will be the big opportunity for EV in the medium term will be what China can produce for us and send our way when it's in that mainstream, early majority, mainstream category as opposed to early majority premium category.
Okay, that's interesting. So we drive a European brand at the moment. So that's interesting. Again, perhaps we need to think about, where our vehicle might come from or what our brand might be. I do have another question, actually. What happens if your car runs out of charge? Is the RACV and those types of organisations set up to come and rescue EV drivers who've run out of battery? And from that's the first part. And then the second part is what happens if you crash your EV? Are companies, are the body shops set up to repair EVs?
The RACV have systems and processes in place to deal with EVs.
Yeah.
So they have their people are trained, and there'll be some solutions that they provide. In the mainstream, I dare say most would be skewed towards the towing side, but the RACV, we really need to. I can't speak on their behalf for the motoring clubs, but they do have solutions for EVs that run out of charge.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the LPG days. If a car ran out of LPG, that was a tow truck straight away. You weren't allowed to fill up LPG on the side of the road. So towing is the simplest solution to get a vehicle to a point of charge. But you'd have to explore that further with the various motoring clubs, whether they do have boosted charges for a short period of time that can give you some sort of energy to move. I really don't have an answer for that one. The second one we talked about, crash. The industry is training already up their people as far as what to do in a crash, isolating the batteries and making sure the appropriate safety processes are undertaken in repair shops. And also first responders are trained. So to make sure that if they're cutting someone out of a vehicle, and this is where they're even just identifying the vehicles with the number plates, that they're an EV, so that they don't just get the jaws of life and cut someone out and cut through a high amperage cable that causes all sorts of problems for everyone. So that and also mindful of batteries with impacts that potentially could start fires, etc. So they're across all of that as well. So there's definitely enough time has gone through. EVs are not new, and that's the beauty of it. They're not new, and the fact that it's a slow uptake has given the other organisations time to upskill and readiness for it. But there's still a long way to go. There's more organisations and other repair shops that need to get up to speed with it. But there is that. There very much is that readiness in sections of the aftermarket for repair.
And insurance, is insurance the same for EV as it is for a petrol vehicle?
I think my expectation it will end up being more, because the fact is the battery is so expensive that you could write off the whole car quicker than you would in terms of an internal combustion engine. So I think it could be more. The other big factor, Steve, which you have to take into account is that governments, through the levy on fuel, they recover quite a big road tax from that levy. We're starting to see that now in Australia, even they say they're going to have to tax EV cars some sort of road tax because they're not recovering that levy through the fuel. And if they don't bring it in now, it's going to cost them quite a lot of revenue in the future. And people are saying, oh, but why are they taxing EVs? But it's just a tax that they've normally taxed through, you paid every time you fill your car up with fuel. And now you're not going to fill up your EV. So they're going to, and because you still drive on the road, you need to pay for that road to be maintained and repaired. And
yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, if you want to put a vehicle on the road, you need to pay for the upkeep of the road. You can't, otherwise we're taking money from somewhere else to update the road. So, I don't have a problem with roads need to be maintained and somehow they need to raise tax money in order to invest in that. So I would expect, governments to charge all of us, irrespective of our vehicle type, for being on the road, because roads need to be maintained. I have less of a problem with that particular issue.
Here you go. I've got some data for you. EVs are 23% more expensive than the equivalent internal combustion vehicle to insure.
Oh, there we go. That's helpful. So that's sort of comparable to the cost of the car in a way, isn't it? 25% more than buying a petrol car in the first place. This is such an interesting topic. As John and I started talking about it over lunch and now over the last few weeks as we've been preparing for this, I've been giving more thought to why isn't the industry or government doing more to help us on this journey of change? This sort of single view of, well, it's green. okay, I get that, but it doesn't cut it. Yeah, okay, I accept it's better for the world, but that doesn't motivate me to, completely change the way I think about running a car. This is a huge change management exercise in many cases, and I don't see anybody really leading the way in change management.
And Steve, you summarise it perfectly. It's the question you asked us, but why aren't we driving them? They're expensive and they're inconvenient.
Yeah.
So how do you have the benefits outweigh those detractors, which are, well, I've got a plug-in, it doesn't suit my lifestyle. The availability is not there because really it's still innovators and early adopters. I'm not an early adopter when it comes to this kind of technology. It's something that definitely doesn't fit my lifestyle. I've got my car out on the street. So therefore, I would be in a similar situation itself. That, well, where am I going to charge it? And then if I suddenly need to have to go somewhere, I'm caught. So, and I'm going to need to be on call very much. I've got 2 teenage kids. I'm running them around everywhere. So, so that doesn't fit the MO for what I need.
Yeah.
But if the cost is there, if the cost and the supply loosens up, then the adoption will be a lot better. But this is where it gets down to it. It's only going to work if that premium is the similar gap to what a hybrid is versus a ICE vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, you're still going to play in the domain of innovators, early adopters.
I think you're going to see the price of the battery come down. But if we wait for that to happen, it's going to take 10, 15 years. So it needs government intervention. If the government doesn't intervene, the process will be very slow. So either putting taxes on internal combustion engines, so raises the cost there, and then putting incentives on electric vehicles to bring the cost down. And then the third part is putting infrastructure in, because you're going to have to subsidize it. So for instance, in Oslo, the government committed there in the first year to set up, I think, 1,300 charging stations and another 300 a year. It was quite big volumes that they would commit every year to be putting in place. And that gives a confidence that to the people that things are happening. But there they can travel on the bus lane, they can travel on ferries for free. They can get free charging in the city, free parking. So a lot of incentives. The only problem now is they reach a stage where there's so many electric vehicles that the express lanes are being clogged. The ferry owners are complaining now there's too many cars going for free on the ferry. There's the parking bays are getting clogged in the city because everybody's lining up to park for free and get free charge. So eventually that has to swing back and they have to start pulling back some of those incentives. And I think you have no registration tax and no license fees. But that too, once the volume gets big, the revenue the government loses is quite high. So they have to try and recover that somewhere.
And it would be political suicide to increase the cost of ICE vehicles simply to try and drive greater purchase of battery vehicles, wouldn't it? I mean, that's unlikely to happen. And on your point about express lanes, every time I go to the San Francisco area, I see it. When we first moved there, you had the dual occupancy express lane, which also you could be used for electric vehicles, and that used to flow beautifully. Now the express lane is just chocker with electric vehicles, so all of that benefit has over a number of years disappeared completely.
And the other thing in terms of taxes on internal combustion engines, what they did in Europe, it wasn't across all engines. So what they did is they put taxes on your bigger engines, so your 3-liter V6, those type of engines they put tax on, and it was based on the emissions of the vehicle. So the bigger it was quite interesting. You focuses your mind very quickly because I think when I got there, I took a Navara 3-liter V6, and the first month I got my tax bill, you get your pay slip, and I was paying €600 tax a month on that vehicle. Yeah. And fortunately, working for an automotive company, you could change your vehicle very quickly. So 2 months later, I was driving a very small car. And people say, in Australia here, we like to drive big cars and that. But that's why I say that can change very quickly if governments change some of the legislation. It's amazing how quickly, when it affects your back pocket, you change. And that's the type of thing that will switch it and make it happen.
And from recollection, the statement, let's say, the UK government have made is, well, the commitment is really around, I think theirs is an EV, not an EV, theirs is a hybrid, isn't it? The vehicles will all be hybrids, at least as a minimum standard. Again, maybe it is that hybrids are a stepping stone to EVs for many families. That might be a way to go. And that, I think, is a good way to go. I don't know whether I'm yet still convinced about an EV because of some of the inhibitors we've talked about. But what this has helped me get a much better understanding of is the cost of the vehicle, the warranties, the insurance, crash repairs. You've got to look at that sort of the total cost of ownership versus the upfront price. There are actually quite a few things that go into your decision. What we need to do as a family to have the ability to charge our cars at a property. There's a whole bunch of things that go into this. It's not as simple as, okay, my current petrol car needs to be changed and I walk into a garage and drive one off the forecourt. There's so much more that goes into the decision around buying an EV.
Absolutely. And thanks for articulating those concerns, because in many instances they're not raised in a forum from an individual's perspective. They're seen as generic concerns, whereas you've been able to really to articulate them as, well, this is my life, this is my world, and how am I going to have this vehicle? How am I going to select a vehicle that then fits in with my world and my changing circumstances, given that the Bendigo Peninsula apartment, no charging, how is that car going to fit in with your life? A bit like getting a new pet. How is that new dog going to fit into that apartment if it's an Alsatian?
Yeah. No, that's
or am I better off with a fish?
Yeah. Probably true. Sure, there are plenty of people in our circumstance thinking we would like to think about an EV. We agree that it's good for the planet, but gee, there's a whole bunch of unknowns that prevent me from making that first step. I feel somewhat more compelled at this stage to think about a hybrid, to say our next investment will be a hybrid, and maybe give EV a little while longer. At least that's a step in the right direction. Played golf the other day with a couple of guys who are both petrol heads. These are guys who've got very nice cars currently. One of them races cars, etc., etc. So true petrol heads, and both of them were looking at it going, they're so boring, to drive. So I think it's not an issue for me, but I was fascinated by the conversation that they were having as owners of, what you would say are prestige cars, going, this is so uninteresting to be driving an EV. So there's that angle as well that applies to certain individuals. Well, where they came to, particularly the guy who races cars, he was like, you sort of see where this is going. Electric vehicles will be our day-to-day sort of mundane cars, and those of us who are petrol heads are going to get the thrill of the car on the racetrack. That was, again, I just hadn't thought about it. It sort of goes to Mark's earlier question about have you driven an EV? Apart from the very fast takeoff, it was a different experience. It is a different experience to drive an EV. And for a true petrol head who loves the sound of the engine, loves, that feeling of a car, that changes. Electric cars do change that again.
I had the good fortune of being or attending 2 Formula E races in Hong Kong, and it is, if you look at a Formula One Grand Prix versus a Formula E Grand Prix, Formula One, it's like earplugs, hurts your ears, or used to. And at the start would be the build up, all the cars revving, and the lights go green, and it's wow, and away it goes. With Formula E, it was like building up, and zzz. That was it. It was just a zzz. And they actually had to, they had the public address system were quite good. I think they were Bose speakers all the way around. And they actually had to have music playing to make it interesting. But the music was like techno music, a bit like Space Invaders type theme music, so that you could actually get involved in the racing, because it was like dunk, 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 dunk. But the upside, and this was a really cool thing, was on your phone, you could vote. It was a bit like a Big Brother, like who you want to vote for. You could vote for your driver to get more power.
Oh, wow.
So you would get on an app, you'd download the app, and you would say, right, I want Nico Prost to have more power this lap. So if enough people voted for Nico Prost versus Wimmy, he would get this burst of acceleration. So when they have the DRS systems, when it's the opening to overtake, you'd then give him an extra power again, so he would overtake the other guy.
Oh, wow. So audience participation was possible.
Correct. And he would get notification that he had more power, and away he would go. So that was very, this was 2016. So we're talking 5 years ago already. So there's the technology's there. The Formula E it's exciting to watch. Yeah. Doesn't sound the same though. That's the only difference. But the cars are fast.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for your time. Really enjoyed that.
No, that's all good, Steve. Thanks very much.
All right, no worries. Bye for now.
See
you. Bye.
Thanks for listening and watching today. Hopefully you got as much out of today as we did. It was interesting to get a perspective from a EV customer as to what are the key considerations when buying an EV, and the support networks around that, and the hidden costs and the lifestyle adaptations that you have to do. If you liked what you saw, please subscribe below to our channel. Reach out to us on LinkedIn or leave a message below and we'll get back to you. If you would like to explore any sponsorship opportunities, please do so by reaching out to us. We'd love to work with you and tell your story, because I'm sure you've got a compelling story to tell. Please follow us once again on LinkedIn. And if you need any other information from us, just drop us a line. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. We'll speak to you again next week.